In this video, we'll be looking back at the Shadow of the Colossus remake. I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, maybe consider leaving me a like and subscribing. What you just saw was some of the most epic, exciting, and exhilarating moments Shadow of the Colossus has to offer. And if you grew up with this, or have seen any online discussion regarding this game, then you might be surprised with what I'm about to say. And if you want a review praising this game, calling it a timeless masterpiece and articulating every little thing it does perfectly, then I would highly recommend you stop watching now. Because while I do think this game would have been a masterpiece back in 2005 when it originally came out, due to its amazing atmosphere, boss design, music, sound design, story, open world, the sense of scale, and the overall experience, there are, however, a few major issues I have with this game. Issues that I never knew up until now were so important to me, that if a game could fundamentally get them so wrong, that it could bring down a masterful experience to just a great one. The issues that I'm referring to have to do with both the camera and how the player controls. Because holy shit, I felt like I was fighting against the game for the 5 hours that it took me to beat it. I'll end the intro here because I don't want the beginning of this video to sound overly negative, because I am very positive towards Shadow of the Colossus. For anyone who has already disagreed with me, I hope I can flesh out why I think the way I do and help you understand how I came to this conclusion. Okay, I want this video to be a short one, so let's get straight into it. Shadow of the Colossus is set in a fantastical world and follows a young man named Wanda. He brings a young female to a forbidden land where he wishes to resurrect her. But when he arrives in this palace-looking place, several voices from above start talking to him and explain what he must do in order to bring her back to life. Now tasked with killing 16 Colossi, you are free to venture out into the open world and complete your mission. Right off the bat, what I really liked about this story was the ambiguity and the mystery surrounding everything, and that holds true all the way through. Shadow of the Colossus doesn't spoon-feed you answers, you don't find out who the young woman is to Wanda, you never find out why Wanda wants to bring her back to life, and that's ultimately because it doesn't really matter. All you need to know is he wants to do this because she's obviously very important to him. Throughout the game, you'll learn that this land is forbidden. It's locked away from the rest of the world, and the only way to get there is from this bridge that seems like it goes on forever. I won't spoil anything, but seeing what slowly happens to Wanda as you progressively cut down the Colossi was kind of poignant. I've seen the word heartbreaking being thrown around to describe this story, and while I wouldn't go that far, as you don't really gain an emotional attachment to anyone, well at least I didn't, it is thought-provoking to see the themes of the story rise to the surface. Things like loss, determination, and what a person will endure to help someone they love. The great stuff doesn't stop there with the story, instead it leaps off from the somber opening. The very first minute you enter this world, mount your trusty horse aggro, raise your sword to the sky, which guides you to the first Colossus, and ride along those empty plains was exceptional. I cannot think of a better way to articulate what type of game this is going to be. By virtue of this being a remake, the first thing you'll notice will obviously be the visual upgrade over the original. Even this being 3 years old now, everything still looks great. Vistas in the distance look massive and abandoned. The rolling green hills that lead to the horizon are freeing yet feel lonely. When you finally encounter one of the Colossi, you'll be able to see the individual strands of hair on their back, and all this runs at a buttery smooth 60 FPS. Then there's the art design. It's very understated in that you'll only really see the barren open world, Colossi which all follow a similar visual style, and some dilapidated ruins. The visual range isn't vast, but what is here is pixel perfect, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Since everything so far has been simplistic, it wouldn't make any sense for the visuals to oppose that. Moving on from that is the way this world feels and how it acts. I can imagine a lot of people saying that this world feels empty and lacking content, compared to what modern audiences usually get in open worlds, and they'd be right to think that. But I loved what was created here. There's ultimately nothing to do in this world besides ride from one Colossus to another, and that's one of its greatest strengths. Riding around with nothing but the sound of your horse and nature helps to build up the thick atmosphere. You feel totally free, yet isolated at the same time, if that makes any sense. There's no music in the world until you encounter a boss, no enemies to mindlessly slice away at, and no distractions to pad out the runtime. Your task is simple. You are to kill the 16 Colossi, so that's what you do. Needless to say, everything this open world has to offer is exceptional and technically marvelous. Now, what about the reason you actually play Shadow of the Colossus? Well, for starters, I thought most of the 16 bosses were fantastic. Each boss, or Colossus, is a mixture of a puzzle and simple platforming rolled into one. The first Colossus is the most simplistic, where you can just run up to its leg and begin climbing. Find the weak points around its body, charge up a melee attack, and release. You'll do this multiple times until you've drained all of its health. Another requires you to shoot the bottom of its feet with your bow to get it to tumble over, allowing you to reach a climbing position. I won't spoil any more of the bosses, but the puzzle elements progressively get harder as you get closer to the final Colossus. What this game achieves that so many others could only dream of is its sense of scale. When you're climbing up the leg of a Colossus 100 times your size, you really feel it. Or when you're scaling atop of a flying creature high above the ground. Or when you're looking at these colossal creatures from the ground, you really feel like the size of an ant. And this is further conveyed in the stamina management system. Since you're just a human, and not even an experienced or well-trained soldier based on your equipment and clothing, ascending to the top of these awe-inspiring colossi shouldn't be an easy task. You run out of stamina very quickly, as the colossi will shake uncontrollably trying to throw you off. You're forced to stay put, holding on for dear life, and if you didn't manage your stamina well enough, then you're not going to last very long. This adds to the excitement and adrenaline you get when you're running out of stamina and the boss is only 1 or 2 hits from being defeated. You'll frantically spam the attack button, hoping the Colossus will stay still for just a second so you can release the killing blow. Finally, you'll be greeted with what was consistently my favourite moment. As you snuff the life out of these innocent creatures, all the sound will cut out for a split second, letting you visually take in the whole experience. It really is fantastic, and I honestly don't think I've ever had this type of experience in a game before. I hope I've described all the things I love about Shadow of the Colossus well enough to convey how much this game gets right. However, I cannot overlook the amount of frustration I felt while playing this because of the blatantly awful camera and controls. Generally speaking, these things have never really bothered me. The camera being so close to Kratos in God of War 2018, I was fine with. People said the original Last of Us was clunky because of its backpack mechanic, but I never noticed it. And I've never struggled with a first-person shooter using a controller. For the most part, controls and camera issues are way down on my list of issues I have with a game. So why is Shadow of the Colossus the exception? Let's start with how it feels to control your character. Moving on foot just feels clunky, like your inputs are ever so slightly delayed. Likewise with your horse, as it'll just do whatever it wants 9 times out of 10. Particularly when you're in a tight corridor, or you hit the smallest incline known to man, and your horse will either just stop abruptly, or will do the complete opposite of your input. The reason this feels bad is because what you're inputting is not being matched on screen, and when it does, there's a slight delay, so you're fighting with your last input to straighten yourself out. I honestly just got to a point where I didn't even bother turning the horse, as it was just easier to let it ride itself. So that's how it feels to control your character and your mount. Separate from all of that is the awkward button layout. Now this is my most subjective issue with Shadow of the Colossus, but it just doesn't make any sense to me. For starters, is triangle being used to call your horse and increase its speed? Calling your horse with triangle is fine, but riding around with triangle is really awkward to me. Then you have to pull back on the left stick to bring it to a stop, but this takes so long for it to work. Why this doesn't feel natural to me is because the speed up button should either have been tied to X or forward with the left stick. And because it doesn't work like that, tying stopping to pulling back just doesn't connect nicely. For example, let's say you're playing a shooter and it's L1 to aim, R1 to fire. Usually square would be reload, which would feel natural, but in this imaginary game, you need to pull back on the left stick to reload. Do you see what I mean? It just doesn't flow nicely. Secondly is that L1 and L2 are basically useless. They focus the camera and point you towards the Colossus you're fighting. But I have a right thumbstick to do both of those things. And this leads us to aiming with the bow. For whatever reason, both aiming the bow and shooting it is tied to the R1 button, which never felt right to me. Again, imagine you're playing a shooter, and to fire your gun, you just press R1 and then R1 again. Furthermore is the fact that you can't move and shoot your bow at the same time. So if you're trying to hit the lizard things to increase your stamina, or a specific part of a Colossus, you're going to be glued to the ground. This is wrong on so many levels, but most importantly is the sense of mobility you have. It's about climbing 100-foot creatures and scaling the ruins of a destroyed world, but when you're trying to use one of your two weapons, you can't move. In any case, this leads us to the camera, and my god, if the controls weren't clunky enough, get ready for the most terrible camera I've ever experienced in a game. This fucking thing gets stuck on everything. When you're walking around trees, it'll get stuck on them, and then teleport to a close-up angle, which causes even more discomfort. When you're climbing a Colossus and it moves its arm, the camera will jerk back and forth, repositioning itself. When you're riding around the open world, the camera will bob up and down, creating so much ridiculous camera shake. Most annoyingly is when you're riding around and want to look at the vistas in the distance, but if you stop turning your camera for a second, it will autocorrect back to the default location. I honestly got to a point with open world travel where I didn't even touch the camera at all and just let the horse do all the work. It's obvious from how the game frames much of the action and cutscenes that this camera was designed for wide, epic sweeping shots. And for the most part, it succeeds with flying colours. However, whenever I was in control of the camera, particularly when confined to tight spaces or climbing the Colossi, I found it extremely jarring and uncomfortable to use. To sum everything up, I really meant all the positive things I said about Shadow of the Colossus. This game, on paper, is near perfect, and it even got most of the execution right. If you put almost every aspect of this game in a vacuum, it works brilliantly. The story feeds into world design seamlessly. Visuals and sound design create an unforgettable atmosphere. The sheer scale of the Colossi you're tasked with going up against are remarkable, and considering this foundation was built on the PS2, is mind-blowing. But when I said earlier that I was frustrated a lot of the time while playing this, I really meant it. I felt like I was always fighting against the controls, and while traversing the world on my horse looked great, it felt awful. The camera was headache-inducing and constantly pulled me out of the experience. Using the bow was a nightmare, as my natural instinct would be to move and aim at the same time, like every other game, but that doesn't work here. If Bluepoint had gone in and modernized these parts of the game a little more, I feel like I'd be a lot more forgiving with my description of them. In short, this game truly is brilliant. It does things better than any other game I've ever played. And while I was frustrated and annoyed for much of my playthrough, I know in the future when I look back at my time with Shadow of the Colossus, I won't remember the terrible camera. I won't be thinking of how it controls. I'll remember the first time I lifted my sword, revealing the location of a Colossus. I'll remember the first time I experienced one of them towering over me, and I'll remember every fleeting moment I relished in the sense of overcoming, despite all odds.